or be my tech person. Thank you for letting me know that. So these are the things we're going to cover today, and I'll have you guys out of here by 11. So quick recap of kind of what we talked about. I do want you to know that throughout the presentation, I'm just going to throw out a few quotes that I think are just really impactful. Think about this when you are writing your volunteer handbook, when you're doing recruitment, when you're doing recognition. You know, are there quotes that maybe aren't the typical ones that we hear that might be really impactful and encouraging for people to see? You know, so if you're thinking about, you know, kind of the advocacy work you do, if you do work that's kind of civics and community-based, maybe some quotes that have to do with democracy or have to do with civic engagement, they might be better or more well-suited to who you're talking to or who you are providing recognition to than maybe a general volunteer quote. So, for example, everyone knows the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, "Everybody can be great because anybody can serve," or a lot of people know it. It's really powerful. If you haven't used that one, then of course, you are, you know, that could be something that's great for you to use in a particular way in your program. But there are a lot of other, again, ways that we can encourage people, that we can incorporate when we're presenting to senior management or donors and so on. So framing volunteering can really be, you know, think about doing that in creative ways. So here we have the health of a democratic society may be measured by the quality of functions performed by private citizens. I mean, that is volunteering 101, right? I'm fist pumping right there. So that's a really great quote for you to use. You know, it could be on a plaque, it could be on, you know, in a card you write, things like that. So I'll have a few quotes throughout the presentation that you can kind of think on. So we discussed the importance, which I just was mentioning with the quote, the importance of the language that you use to convey the vital nature of volunteer work to your communities, potential volunteers, existing volunteers, the people who benefit from your mission. Make sure that you're telling them and really explaining to them why volunteers are important. They can become volunteers. They may volunteer at other agencies or places in your community, which is just overall better for your community. They may tell other people, you know, I'm involved with this particular organization. I receive their services, or I you know, work with them, and it is just so neat to know what their volunteers are doing to help grow their mission, expand their mission, and so on. To your senior management, as you're making sure that volunteering and volunteer programming is incorporated into the strategic plan for the organization, if that's something that's realistic, and your donors. So be thinking again about what language really best describes not just the impact that, you know, the storytelling component, but then also just really shapes for people that this volunteerism reality we have in our country is not the nice but unnecessary way that people think of it, which I know you all know. So we, again, talked about this language. You know, these are some adjectives you can use when you think about the importance of the work you do, of the importance of volunteering. And, you know, we don't have to be desperate. We don't bow and grovel before people for volunteers. What we do, though, is say, hey, here is how critical and important and vital this work is. You know, we want you to be a part of it. So clear, compelling language should be used strategically throughout the volunteer management cycle, whether it's recruitment, whether it's how you craft your messaging on your website, whether it's your volunteer handbook. Put quotes in there, put pictures in there. You know, you can even do that on your application, anything that might encourage people and, again, shape that messaging of volunteerism and then shape the impact that your organization has. Okay. So I use this volunteer management function cycle that's from the Corporation for National and Community Service. They're the ones that fund AmeriCorps and our other funding opportunities, but a lot of other, you know, volunteer management associations, a lot of other volunteer management books and articles use this cycle. And if you note there, it talks about what success is. And when we talk about evaluation, keep this in mind. What is it that you use to indicate that your volunteer program is successful? Here are a couple of thoughts about success. And again, this is great language. So you say volunteers helped us achieve community impact, or volunteers impacted our community. There's another little slight change to that, if you say, what we intended to do in terms of our community impact, we were able to achieve using volunteers, right? So then you're really saying, okay, we had an outcome or we had an output and we were able to achieve that because of volunteers, so people really recognize how critical they were to just the basics of what you wanted to do in your community. Something like, we were able to improve the volunteer experience in these ways. That could be something that's really great to share with senior management and something like that. A lot of people don't report on retention, but I think that can be really great if you say, listen, we had 100% retention rate from last year's school year or something like that. Of course, if it's not great, that's understandable, or it may not be the best measure for you, and we'll talk a bit more about why a little bit later. But again, these are just some ways that you can think about addressing the impact volunteers have. I really love fewer redundancies in services or addressing gaps in services. Again, language that you can use that really helps clarify to people why volunteers are important. And then a variety of things that we covered, the value of volunteerism, their motivations, just that, the foundation, heartbeat of your organization, that's your vision, mission, values, and principles. And so they should really frame and inform your volunteer management cycle, strategic assessments, your policies and procedures, planning before recruitment, screening, making sure you have those position descriptions, as well as orientation and training. And I do want to remind you all, this is a volunteer management basics series, so we really aren't covering every volunteer function in a lot of depth. But over the course of the year, we will have webinars that kind of go into more detail in some of these areas. So I hope you keep that in mind, and we'd love for you to join us for those things. So here's another quote I wanted to share. And some of you may have heard this one, but if you haven't, great. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the community, and as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. That makes me teary-eyed almost a little bit. It is just a really beautiful quote. And again, if you had a certificate of the number of years or certificate where you talk about somebody's impact and you had this in bold on the top and you put it in a frame, that's a little different from just having a certificate that says Certificate of Recognition, 10 years of service. And that is wonderful. People really appreciate that. But think about if you just added a quote that was more prominent, and then if somebody put it up, that quote is there as well as some acknowledgement of their service and their impact. All right, so I want to go into preparing your staff. So when we talk about volunteer management, really want to make sure, sorry, I skipped one. There we go. Your paid staff in each department can be expected to know their own jobs, of course, ideally, but be careful not to assume two important things. One is that they truly understand volunteer assignments, or that they know how to do training, especially of part-time workers or part-time volunteers rather. So if you kind of are defaulting to somebody to help orient a volunteer, let's say you're a little too busy, or you say, hey, Jane, can you touch base with this volunteer and show them the ropes, so to speak. Be careful assuming that they know how to do that, or that they really understand the layers of what that volunteer does. And I really like these two. And by the way, you all will receive the citations for all this information when I give you the slide. Underneath each slide will be a reference point. So these diagrams here, think about what this looks like. On the left, you have staff and they tell you what they need volunteer assignments wise, and you as that volunteer engagement coordinator, you're the one who consolidates all of that, and you are that sole connection to the volunteers. Then if you think about it the other way, staff and volunteers are connected to one another, and you as kind of that central hub are aware of all of those dynamics. And I think that's really a best practice. It doesn't mean every single staff member knows every single detail, but that they have a working knowledge of the volunteer work that you do is going to be important. They'll be able to report if they see something that isn't quite right going on because they have an understanding of it. They're able to better encourage the volunteers and appreciate the volunteers, all of which connects to the volunteers' experience and connects to retention. So all of these things are connected. So be thinking about that. You know, are you sort of that funnel, so to speak, where there really isn't any understanding from the staff about the work that volunteers do and what their needs are, what their purpose is. Okay. So a couple of things that are really important. What should volunteers expect from you? And I do want to let you know, so with Volunteer Connect and in general with Volunteer Florida, one of the things we want to start to do is post resources for volunteers. And one of the things we're looking at right now specifically is what would we want to tell volunteers they should either expect or keep an eye out for from organizations. And we'll certainly send that to you so you know what we're promoting there. But people should be able to understand what their assignments are and have a clear understanding of that. They should know where all of the bathrooms are and things like that. But we're going to be crafting some messaging around that so that volunteers know, hey, this is something that, I should keep an eye out for. So keep that in mind. What should volunteers expect from you? Obviously, your core policies and procedures, that you are going to be oriented and trained, that they're going to have clear expectations and responsibilities there, that they have the resources that they need. And this is so important, this support and guidance to accomplish those tasks. I know a lot of you wear many hats, and this is where either volunteer leaders or your other staff members come in to help you do that, so that along the line of time that a volunteer is working with your organization, they have that continued support and guidance. And I'll send this to you all as a resource, but a lot of organizations have what's called a volunteer bill of rights, and they can get really specific and be really they can really put, not burden, but a lot of work onto the organization to kind of achieve those rights and make sure that they're there for the volunteers. But it's really an interesting thing to think about. I saw one, and it was everything from they have a right to view our financials to, so many things. And obviously as a nonprofit, you have to, have your 990 and your audit available, but, explicitly saying all of that could be a little bit burdensome. But I'll send you guys some resources because it could be something that's really neat to put into your volunteer handbook. And just remember that management is continual and dynamic. Again, with that support and guidance, being aware when it comes to supervision and all of that, you're working with people. And so that always means an adventure. I shared this in our last webinar, but just making sure, again, with those resources and equipment, that people have what they need and that they have the guidance. I've been involved in volunteering where I went in, I got my assignment, and then the computer was locked and I couldn't find anybody to give me the password. So little things like that, or, okay, well, how am I supposed to email the people that you told me to email? And then off you go and I don't have the email password, or, there are little things like that. Walk yourself through what a volunteer might need. You can have existing volunteers tell you, hey, here are some things that I didn't have that would have been beneficial ahead of time, and so on. So we're going to go ahead and go into supervision. It is really important for you to manage and monitor expectations. Sometimes this produces a difficult volunteer because they don't have a good understanding of what your expectations are and what the expectations are that they should have for the organization, and then the expectations that you have for them as volunteers. So we want to be very clear about that. Now, certainly when you're an employee, people don't walk around reminding you of your job description necessarily, but some of those bigger picture expectations, you want to be sure that you periodically mention those, and you can do it in a very positive, proactive way. It doesn't have to be reactive. So every time somebody, people are late, but you can sit down and say, hey, the work you do here is so important. And so if you're going to be late, if you don't mind just letting us know, or if you don't think you can show up, you can say it in ways that, again, are couched in the importance of volunteering, but that also, the behavior isn't necessarily acceptable. Pay attention to small details, and that's the little things I was talking about. The person doesn't have a password for the computer. They don't know where the pens and the Post-its are. Things like that. Or you say, oh yeah, just talk to Lizzie when you need something, and they have no idea who Lizzie is or where Lizzie is, or Lizzie doesn't know that you have told volunteers that they can ask her things. So Lizzie is quite busy, and all of a sudden volunteers are rolling into her office asking her things, and she didn't realize that that was something that she needed to do. So those are small things, and of course you all have so much time. So, I know that it's not realistic to, and you don't want to micromanage or have everything under a microscope, but do keep that type of thing in mind. And you can ask and should ask whether the role matches the volunteer's needs and expectations, especially if you see somebody's energy slowly start to drain over time, or when you're doing orientation and training work, making sure that you kind of reassure and clarify those expectations and that match. So if somebody comes in and they want to be a mentor, and you've let them know, some of this mentorship work is really just interacting with the kids and socializing with them and helping them to kind of see and healthy relationships and boundaries. But that person keeps saying, I really wish I were teaching them more things. I wanted to really read to kids. I really wanted to, whatever the thing is, you can go back to, helping that volunteer understand what it was that you enlisted them for, and so on. So I do think that feedback is important. We know that can be, there can be a little bit too much of that sometimes, but you do want to ask if you're perceiving something, whether that's actually true or not. Whether it's with a difficult volunteer who just seems unhappy, volunteers who are doing really, really well, you also want to touch base with them. Do you have concerns? There are people who won't want to say something, and so being able to touch base with them just so that they have the freedom, now that you've asked me, here's a couple of things. So you want to keep that in mind. And then, of course, as I say, because I am a broken record, you want to be sure that you are reminding volunteers of their impact. And, we're talking about this quote, maybe it's just that one of the emails you send to volunteers, you put that quote there and you just say, hey, and hey, this is what we see and think about you all. And then you go, here are a couple of the things that you all have been doing that have been so great. And here's something that Lizzie, that staff member who had, that we referred you to for questions, she said, all of the volunteers who came in, they just seemed so excited to be here. And I'm just so glad that they're part of the work we're doing. There you go. That's a quick email that you can send along with maybe other announcements that encourages your volunteers. So, what goes along with this is making sure that there's a framework for volunteers. So who do they go to if they have a concern? Just making sure that kind of thing is clear to them is really important. And remember, just always remember, it's the squeaky wheel. I don't even know that quote, how it goes. Squeaky wheel gets the grease or the oil, something like that. I believe you all understand what I'm saying. But you do have people who are really quiet, and they, as I mentioned, aren't going to say something, or they're concerned to say it in a group. So I will certainly pipe up in a large group setting as a tremendous extrovert, and sometimes that might not even be ideal. But there are a lot of people who will not do that, and so you want them to have the opportunity to share one-on-one, or even have an anonymous way to talk about a complaint or a concern. And you can frame that. So, hey, listen, we want you to know that you can submit things anonymously, but if it is about these things, harm, et cetera, things in your policies and procedures, we do need you to identify yourself. So you can certainly cover your bases in terms of policies and procedures and so on. So this is an encouragement for you all. I just, on the other slide, had dealing with difficult volunteers. So as I talk about it, I just wanted to put this in front of you. This is Albert Einstein. It's not that I'm so smart, it's just that I stay with problems longer. So sometimes we have to do with that. And I don't mean the volunteer staying with you necessarily, but just really, immediately it's sort of like, what are we going to do? And taking a step back is really important. I strongly suggest, your volunteer coordinators should have a working relationship with human resources, because they can provide you with perspective. Obviously, they may be focused on employees, but there could be some good points that they have that could be helpful for you. So you may need to troubleshoot with other people, maybe somebody outside your organization, keeping the volunteers' name confidential, but sometimes you really just need to think through, do some critical thinking about how best to deal with a particular issue. This is the same thing with recruitment, with training, and that's why we go back all the time to the importance of strategic planning to maximize volunteer impact. It isn't just kind of this is what we did last year, but really thinking through, okay, where are there hurdles and what can we do about it? So it really does apply to many things, but specifically with difficult volunteers, stay with, okay, what exactly is the issue? Get the information that you need. He said, she said, we know is just the bane of our existence, but it's the kind of thing where you move somebody to another really appealing opportunity, that you have within your organization. Sometimes you have to just keep very short accounts. So if it is somebody who is problematic, maybe you are present when they are volunteering a little more often than you are with some of your more hands-off volunteers. Maybe you check in with them a little more often. We'll be doing other webinars with more discussion about dealing with difficult volunteers, but a core component of that is making sure that those expectations are clear for them and that your policies and procedures are clear. And those should not be gathering dust, and those should not be something that you kind of say, hey, our policies and procedures are available online if you want to look at them. No, you want to have clearly in multiple ways, whether written and then in emails if you need to remind people, and in those trainings, you want to be very clear, and you can refer to those things. You want to be able to go back and say, well, here's the discussion we had, and so this is the track we've been following based on what you what you indicated, and also these have always been our procedures. This is what we do when there's an issue. If you have, you all probably have those grievance policies and so on for employees, or there may be some kind of workflow, so to speak, when there are issues with an employee. If Human Resources has that, or even if you look online for that. Sometimes when you look online for volunteer-specific things, it's hard to find. You can find plenty about employees, and then, of course, you need to cater it to volunteers, but a lot of the structure for policies and procedures can be found for employees and then kind of specified for volunteers. So that's a way to do that. So stick with those problems. Again, I don't mean, analysis by paralysis, but just that you may need to do some hard critical thinking and decision making in order to solve the problem. And then keep in mind, do not over-police people with policies, which is very difficult. There's a fine line there. But, a 40-page policy manual expecting to either go through that entire thing during orientation or for people to read it on their own isn't likely. Some of you work with vulnerable populations. There are a lot of policies and procedures that people need to follow, so I'm certainly not making light of that. But really think about, if you have a volunteer and they did something that was a problem, there are a lot of organizations that immediately write a policy for it and send it to everybody. And some of you may have worked in situations like that. So somebody did not complete their paperwork right. All of a sudden now you have a new policy on paperwork. So be careful with that, because then you get people looking like this and not interested in volunteering because of how stringent things are or how much they have to remember about what they need to do. Again, some of you have to have lots of policies and procedures. So the only point here is don't have any more than you actually need. So we're going to go next into supervision and evaluation. And this is part of supervision is evaluating your volunteers. So effective evaluation is conducted at regular intervals. That's really important, and draws information from a variety of sources. Your fellow coworkers, Catherine and Aaron, they have mentioned to you that Audrey is just really a pain, and maybe Audrey is fantastic with your clients, or is fantastic in, the gardening work that you're doing, or, it's fantastic in helping people in the art classes that she's supporting. But then when she actually interacts with any staff members, she's a problem. So that's, you kind of want a 360 way of looking at people's performance. So then self-evaluations, I think that's a great thing to it's really helpful when you see that a person gave themselves strongly agree and 5s all across the board, and then your staff or you have 2s on there, there's definitely discrepancy there. And then your program records, what have they shown up on time? Have there been discipline issues? Have they gone above and beyond? Have they submitted everything they need to submit, and so on? So a number of different ways that you can pull in that evaluation. And I know that it can be tedious, just like in any other area of our job, but keeping those records is extremely critical, so you have that paper trail. And that information, it presents a picture of the volunteer's effectiveness. The information should be shared with the volunteer in such a way that it reinforces their contributions, again, that language, emphasizes the volunteer's impact on the organization, focuses on the volunteer's skills and accomplishments. So those are all positive things. And then you can add in needs, needs improvement, or, we'd love for you to work towards this if necessary. Or, because they're great, you just get to laud them in all those areas, which always feels really good. Recognition and retention. So bear with me on this quote. It says, "The life of a republic lies certainly in the energy, virtue, and intelligence of its citizens." When you think about what volunteers do, especially just depending on what they do for your organization, whether it's the energy or they're just genuine goodwill to serve people, or it's just that the intelligence that they bring to the work that they're doing, this really covers most of the benefits that that citizens bring. So, the true life of the society we live in, the community that we have, really does rely on the energy, virtue, and intelligence of our citizens and that action that they take. So this could be something that you use again and then kind of extrapolate on or specify it to a particular volunteer when you're recognizing them. Okay, so 2 things before we go into suggestions about recognition are, 1, consistency, okay? Make sure that whatever standards of recognition you establish can be consistently maintained by your organization in years to come. This is not always reasonable or achievable, so hear me on that. But if this year you have an extra set of money to do something for volunteers, be careful that volunteers don't think that's going to always happen every 6 months or every year. I just spoke with a colleague about an issue that had to do with that, and somebody who had an expectation of a type of recognition that they weren't to receive that year. And the program had been very clear about it, but this person really wanted another plaque. They really wanted that plaque, and they got a certificate. And I know that isn't, probably typically an issue. But if you give plaques at 5 years, but in between you only give certificates, or if you only have a recognition event for, certain volunteers for such and such a reason, make sure that information is clear, that people understand that. And, you can have, if it's a money thing, have the minimum type of recognition that you do. If you have really outstanding volunteers, you want to be careful that you're not spending a lot of time recognizing them over others in a way that's obvious. So you sending them a personal note or an email, mentioning what you appreciate is great, but you want to make sure that that's consistent across the board. Appropriate to the achievement is really important. So again, we're talking about paper and plaques, but a paper certificate accompanied by a private thank you might be appropriate for a few months of service, but a public dinner and engraved plaque may be suited for 10 years of volunteerism. So just be thinking about that. And obviously there's smaller kind of maintenance recognition that you do throughout the year, and we'll be talking about some of that. But especially with some of those more formal types of recognition, you want to think about how appropriate it is. This person's put their heart and soul into something for the last year, really made a lot of sacrifices. What really is most important in how you recognize that individual and other individuals. So ways you can recognize volunteers. I know this is always something that people ask about when I'm talking with organizations. So, of course, length of service, and, of course, impact. I'm going to show you an example, the personal touch, which is really personalizing what it was that volunteer did. So they're, it's a sporting event and they're doing registration for it. And you had a couple of athletes come and say, that person just wished me luck on my race or, my tennis match, and it was just so encouraging, things like that. Again, you say, listen, there were a few of the participants who said they just really appreciated how warm you were or how helpful you were because they were confused about where to go. So keeping a little track or making some notes about those personal things volunteers did can be really helpful. Provide leadership opportunities, have volunteers in charge of volunteers. That's always a really great thing. Or, increasing their role should they have an interest in that. And, if somebody's really interested in the work that you're doing, share information with them. If you've got resources that you use, let's say it's a person's experiencing homelessness and you have resources that your organization uses about how to move people from emergency housing to transitional housing to permanent shelters and to grow in self-sufficiency. And you have somebody who just seems really fascinated and interested and cares about how people experiencing homelessness develop more security, and say, hey, we have this really great electronic filer, this book. Do you want to borrow it and learn more about it? This is just a little one. Send volunteers a tea bag and a card and ask them to enjoy a cup of tea in the quiet of their own home. So what that's doing there is directing them to self-care, which selfishly is helpful for you. You want to make sure your volunteers are taking care of themselves. Might be a little odd in an envelope, so maybe not that. But, maybe you do that in a little bag or something. The tea is not very expensive, or 2 or 3 bags, something like that. Or, if your office uses mugs for recognition, toss the tea bags in there and tell people, give them a reason to use the mug. Explain to them why you gave them the mug instead of it just being a mug. Asking those volunteers, one who maybe is you just love the experience they've had, invite them to a board meeting for your organization or an advisory council meeting. Ask them to speak about their experience, or even if they have information or a type of education that's really helpful, they can present on something. It doesn't have to just be, I've had a really great experience as a volunteer and here's why, but hey, here's some things that I do in my job that I want to share with you all. Their events and so on, and other volunteers. Thank you from your clients, from the individuals or the constituents you serve, and from senior leadership again. So to get something from a CEO or a CFO, it's a little bit different from getting it from, a volunteer coordinator, although that's really critical as well. Now, this one you have to be careful of, but I think it could be really neat, is if you have somebody who is volunteering and they're really trying to gain skills for employment or for work that they do, and you could ask them, of course, their permission, but say, hey, I'd love to just send a little note or a quick email to your employer to tell them how great you're doing. I think that that's really powerful. I mean, even, when I think about that, I think, wow, that would be so neat if the executive director of the organization that I'm on the board for sent an email to my boss and just said, hey, I know that Jovita does great work where you are. Hopefully they'd say that. But I also wanted to let you know about her volunteer service and how much we appreciate that she does this kind of work. And then even to family and friends, if that's appropriate as well, or you have those connections. If you have teenagers volunteering, like for scholarships and things like that, of course, if you want to touch base with them about that too, but it could be great to say, hey, I'm going to write a personal note to your mom and say you did a great job. That's huge. And again, we talked about using quotes. So the co-presentation, I mentioned that to you all. Maybe they do, the presentations, but maybe they do a co-presentation with one of your salaried employees. That's a really wonderful opportunity. And again, all of this is recognition. So they do that at a conference, a workshop, maybe a staff development or a staff meeting. Maybe have reserved seating for a volunteer in an event. So, we have one of our grantees, our center down in Miami, and they do just really great work, have, I think, a couple of different theaters, and they have just this wonderful core of ushers. And so maybe you find out which ushers have a particular interest in the show and say, hey, we're going to give you 2 front row tickets to that. And it could be maybe for a donor event you have or something else going on, give them that prized place so that they can see and enjoy whatever the event or the experience is. This one isn't always possible, but provide good coffee if you're providing coffee, or maybe just have tea there that's not expensive. Or, if your coffee isn't ideal, maybe invest in some good creamers. Little things like that can really be helpful for people. Yes, it's experience, but it's also an I see you, and it is recognition ultimately. Especially if you have a smaller group of volunteers, $5 gift card can buy a small fancy drink at Starbucks. So do you notice that you have volunteers who are always bringing that in? That can be the appreciation token that you give to them. And then one thing to do is on the application that the volunteer has, or in an interview, ask them why they volunteer. And then come back to that in recognition. So you don't have to say on your application you stated this, but you can incorporate that. So somebody says, this organization helped me so much when I was in college, to transition me into college in a really great way. I really appreciated the social services support that I got. And then you can say something about that you are giving back in the same way that you received, and so on. So that's a great thing that you're able to bring back around when it comes to recognition. When you're writing those little cards, you can say something like, here's what our staff said about the work you do. And that could even be in the card, is that's maybe what you put at the top. And then each staff member or several staff members writes a little thing, or here's what our client said about the great work that you do. You could even, in a recognition of that, have a PowerPoint. Now, of course, you'd want to make sure you did this for every person, but you could say, here's what our client said, and then have a quote from each, for each volunteer, not necessarily from every client or every individual that you serve or work with, and you have a quote on a PowerPoint for each volunteer. How amazing is that? You walk up, you get your 10-year or your 1-year certificate, and that's really great, but then you have this PowerPoint maybe with music or whatever, and it's got a quote for each volunteer from either a staff member or someone else that says why that person's important. I mean, that is so powerful. I haven't really seen that happen or that occur, but, it probably does. I just think it's something that could be really great. So then the other thing, again, is sort of design and so on. I want to show you guys something. So there's a website called canva.com, and some of you are aware of it, especially around the webinar last week, but you'll get a list from me of sites with free graphic design, and this is not your usual clip art. These are really great pictures. I did this in about 5 seconds, and there's even more that you could do. But, because of your care and guidance, Hillary and Bill will experience more academic and personal success in college, right? And that's why I put books on there. But Jordan is a volunteer, and this is what I wrote. You can make something like that. You can use Print Studio. I mean, you could even do all of this on your iPhone, but you have a little 4x4 print out of this. You can use like Social Print Studio, probably Snapfish or something, and then get frames that are 4x4. And then that person just has a small token of your appreciation, or certainly it could be a photograph or something like that too. So here's another quote that I think is really powerful. No one is useless in this world who lightens the burdens of another. Again, something that you can use in recognition. So these were just a couple of different examples from, I believe it was the Canva site, but these are templates, so you could just use those. That bottom right one, you can have a quote from a client and then have the name of the client at the bottom or something like that. So there's lots of different things that you can do. And you know what? You use these on social too. So you already have that. You can either email it to somebody, you can print it out for a volunteer. You can also post to social some really cool graphic about all your volunteers, a specific group of your volunteers for that week, or a particular volunteer that you really want to say thank you to. All right, so another quote that I think is really powerful is, it's not enough to have lived. We should be determined to live for something. May I suggest that it be creating joy for others, sharing what we have for the betterment of personkind, bringing hope to the lost and love to the lonely. Now that may not, all of that may not apply specifically to the type of work that you do, but it could. Sports and recreation, there's so many other layers where it's about joy, it's about health, it's about, people living their best lives, so to speak, and so you craft your messaging around that. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a quick what not to do with recognition. All right, so hopefully you all see that this person, Brendan, uses a stamp because there are probably lots of birthday cards going around, okay? This is a tough one, and I know none of you do this, and hopefully no one is thinking right now that I can get a custom-made stamp. Perfect. Yes, custom stamps in general. No, not one that has just a specific line that you typically have to write, okay? So that's your quick what not to do, which I know none of you does. Let's talk about retention, okay? It is less expensive than recruitment. Very important to keep the same person rather than outreach to get other people. Now, keep in mind, it's really important, it's okay if people don't come back. There are a lot of reasons that people don't, and that's fine. And it might be best for you or the organization. Or you may be able to get more done with a certain set of volunteers working at kind of a higher level than having more there. So keep that in mind. And then you may have somebody who's like, I'm kind of done with this particular assignment. Do you have other opportunities that might be available for that person? And you can share those with existing volunteers so that you can, shake things up a little bit for them. So I have a little note here from Barry. Yes, we need to be careful as leaders to not fall into that trap that recognition means we have to give them something tangible, or that recognition is an event. Absolutely, I completely agree, Barry. Let's see, recognition is about deeply knowing the intrinsic motivators. Let's see, sorry, I just scrolled down. Of that individual, and then matching your recognition events with what matters most to them. Often that can be accomplished just by using your words, the lowest investment, highest return type of recognition. Well, Barry, you should teach this section. So we have Dana, who's going to do all the tech work for me to make sure everyone can see my screen and hear me. And then Barry, very well said. Thank you so much for that. It doesn't have to be tangible in that specific way. I love swag. But I only love swag if it's something that I need. If you go and you look at Goodwill, you see tons and tons of things from organizations that people have, donated and so on. It doesn't mean that they're not valuable or that you shouldn't do it. But again, put a little thought into what would be absolute best for your volunteers. If you can't do it at an individual level, think about the kind of work all your volunteers do and some of the personality traits you see generally in those individuals, and then, kind of go from there. All right, so just another quote here, just as a thought for you all. Charities that use volunteers to recruit other volunteers have higher retention rates. Having volunteers represent the charity organization implies trust, evidence of a, positive organizational culture, and confidence that the charity provides a worthwhile experience for volunteers. So you have people maintaining gardens at a park. You have people who are coaches for rec leagues and so on. Those individuals, sometimes they don't even realize that they're not sharing and could be helping to recruit, right? There are times where I have a volunteer, I'm volunteering for something, and, I may tell a friend in passing, but if somebody said specifically, like, we would love you to encourage your family and friends to volunteer. Can you think of anybody who might want to do this? Sometimes you have to be explicit with people that that's something that you think would be great for them to do. And then they are ego involved. Wow, I have an opportunity to represent this organization and encourage people to volunteer. So using your own volunteers to recruit new volunteers is great. So we're going to go into measuring volunteer impact, and then we'll be finished up. Okay, so I read this the last time, so I won't this time, but I do want to kind of paraphrase. If you in 2018 had 100 individuals and they planted 1,000 trees, and you measure volunteer impact by output, which those are, they are outputs, not outcomes, then you can say that we had 100 individuals, 1,000 trees, and that's what you would say in your report, which is really great. If the next year you had 50 volunteers plant 1,000 trees, then what you see there is that that the number of volunteers has decreased. And if you're only using, for example, volunteer hours and the number of volunteers, then that doesn't look good. But the output was the number of volunteers and the hours. But, the planting of 1,000 trees happened both years. So when you're telling the story of the work and the impact that you're doing, make sure you don't stick with just those numbers that we hear about, which are really important. But you would want to emphasize, we had 50 volunteers and we were able to achieve the same amount as when we had 100 volunteers. That's really great. Now, that might be annual report. You have to think about who you share that with, because the idea is you still want more volunteers. You want to have another 50 and plant 2,000 trees. But keep that in mind, that even if your number of volunteers goes down, that doesn't mean that you haven't had the same or greater impact or impact in other areas. All right. So if you're thinking about, why do I really have to measure this? I don't have time for this. I just need to go into the next year of recruiting volunteers and so on. It illustrates that volunteer work is sizable and creates significant economic value. They constitute a far more significant share of the workforce here in the United States than is typically recognized. And they are an enormous renewable resource for social problem solving, which I think is a really great way to put it. It informs effective management practices and decision-making about strategy and approach, which kind of have outlined some. It describes the real value of volunteers and contributes to strong applications for funding, if that's what you're, when you apply for a grant and you have to share about the capacity building work that you do, or how you're able to leverage volunteers, or how your overall organizational structure works, and volunteers are a big component of that can be really significant in grant applications. And it encourages existing volunteers and staff members to know that return on investment and what that work was that they were able to do. So again, these are the things that we typically measure: number of persons who volunteer, type of work they performed, number of hours volunteered, where they volunteered, type of work that they do, their ongoing commitment to volunteering, or the volunteer's history. All extremely important and really helpful. So these are core foundational things. It's not that they are expendable or that you shouldn't report on them, but they're core things, and there's more out there. So part of the benefit is that this is continuous improvement for your organization. Okay, if you focus only on the number of volunteers, the number of hours served, then the only things to improve are the number of volunteers and the number of hours served. So anything that you measure, that's where you can, is a launching point for you. So you want to be able to have that data so that you can, in the next year, improve upon those particular values. And when you do that, you realize, wait a second, is the actual need we have, do our volunteers actually match that? Sometimes when you look, you realize, wow, we have volunteers in this particular type of work that we've done, but maybe this isn't the most efficient, effective way to use volunteers. And you get that from the feedback and the data that you get from measuring volunteer impact. And so maybe you realize that we need these individuals who come into this setting to work with this vulnerable population. We have, well, actually, I'll give you an example. My father is a deacon at a church, and so he does chaplaincy work at a couple of prisons in the area. My dad is a professional engineer. He's retired. He's a professional engineer. He did mining engineering, and he has an MBA. He has done business consulting, all kinds of things. He loves his work as a deacon. Once the staff member realized what his actual resume was, he said, hey, could you come in and teach? I think it was like communication, something. My dad was like, absolutely. My dad just hadn't thought, wow, there's these other layers. He really enjoyed the work that he was going in and doing with the individuals in these facilities, but there were other layers of the kind of work that he could do. So it was asking, but then it was looking at, okay, here are the things that we are lacking in, and as we measure them, we realize over here we've got people doing this particular work, and this work is maybe not suffering, but it's kind of languishing. So what do we need to do there? But it doesn't happen unless you're measuring and paying attention to that. It helps with a proof of retention. Was something meaningful accomplished? If not, what's the value of what you're even measuring? So keep that in mind. So last couple things. With measuring volunteer impact, if you're thinking, well, what should I measure? And again, this doesn't have to be complicated. This isn't, program evaluation, kind of, deal details, but who, what, when, where, and why is a great framework for you to start with in terms of how you measure volunteers. Who do you want to measure? What do you want to measure? Some of this is just the timeline for it, when, where, why, but also who do you want to measure? Obviously, volunteers. What about your clients or the people that you work with do you want to measure in terms of how volunteers impact them? Things like that. Do you want to measure at the beginning of the year and at the end? Things like that. And then with relevant reporting, how do you want to do it? Are you doing surveys? Are people checking in on a kiosk so you know their hours and you know where they are? Things like that. And then what's next? So are there additional layers to that evaluation that you want to include? What are you going to do with the data? Who are you going to present it to? And that's the so what problem are you solving? So don't just have, a bunch of measures just to have them. And I'll, one of the resources I'll give you is the book that some of this information is from on measuring volunteer impact. But, most of us, as organizations don't have that kind of capacity, but it is a good thing to think about, what exactly do I want to measure and why? Who are the people, who are the audiences that are going to be looking at this? Let's, consider some different measures. If you recall when I showed you that volunteer management functions list and the success features, little phrases in the inside of it, one was, okay, we address these gaps in service delivery, et cetera. Those are the kinds of things you can look at to get ideas of, hey, here's what we want to measure. This would be something really interesting or really important for us to be able to show in terms of success with our volunteers. All right. So I am finished up. It is 11 o'clock. Just wanted to say again, thank you guys so much for participating. The recording will be available in the next several business days, as well as I'll actually email you, and then I can post the resources from this webinar. Just keep in mind, we've got funding opportunities, training resources. Would love for you all to register for Volunteer Connect if you haven't. And with those funding opportunities, we have two now. If you do any sort of disaster relief work connected to Irma or Michael, we do have the Florida Disaster Fund that is accepting proposals now. And then the Volunteer Generation Fund, which is probably going to be most relevant for lots of you. So definitely have a look at volunteerflorida.org/grants, or if you just go to the site in general, you can click on grants. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to send you a survey, and I hope you'll be willing to complete it. It's like 3 questions. That's my email address if you ever want to touch base with me about any questions that you have. But thank you so much for your time, and I hope that this was helpful, or you got a few bits of encouragement or perspective